It would be hard to argue that in the early 1960s, General Motors was at anything other than the top of its game. GM styling had been knocked down in 1957 when Chrysler introduced its so-called forward-look cars. But the melt and repour of what was to become the 1959 models actually ended up proving highly successful, and GM was starting to get back on top yet again. Moreover, Chrysler was, by this point in the early 1960s, starting to produce some funky-looking vehicles as Virgil Exner's tenure as the head of Chrysler's design would start to come to an end. Thus, GM entered the 1960s with a good-looking 1960 Chevrolet in the Impala that you see here. But it had been a few years of these so-called batwing quarters, and while they looked novel in 1959 and good in 1960, it was time for a new look as General Motors was revamping its entire full-size lineup for the 1961 model year. Thus, Chevrolet designers were looking for a new direction for this vehicle, a car that they envisioned as being a bit slimmer and trimmer than the 1960 models that preceded them, and also more modern. This is going to be then the story of the 1961 Chevrolet Impala specifically, though you should know that the lineup for 1961 Chevrolets was much broader than just the Impala. In fact, there was the Biscayne Fleetmaster, the Biscayne, the Bel Air, and a station wagon to supplement the Impala, although of all the models, the Impala was the best-selling with 491,000 units sold. In total, when the model year would run out, Chevrolet would sell almost 1.2 million 1961 Chevrolets. And we're, as I said, going to tell the story of it from the beginning. Designing the 1961 Chevrolets really began in earnest in late 1957. And you can see from this clay model, from that particular time frame, the designers are really straddling some of the old and some of the new. For instance, you can see on the roofline of this particular vehicle that designers have gotten rid of that full wraparound windshield, but they still have a very heavy style roof. It's, I guess, lighter than some of the mid-50s cars, but it's still heavy by the, let's say, late 1950s standards after Chrysler had introduced the 1957 cars with those beautiful, relatively thin roofs, especially like the 1957 Chrysler 300. Now, this car, it's almost like designers just felt like they had to put so many different shapes within a shape on this. You have a relatively bulbous form, and then you have this spear-like shape kind of scalloped out of the body side with three little ridges, I guess you could call them, at the origination point there just under the quarter glass. Then you have a full-length body side crease and a relatively bulbous form, kind of as I mentioned, overall. It's a bit round and doughy, and I guess the designers are trying to make it look maybe a little bit more skinny and tailored with that scalloped form and the crease, which interestingly seems to grow in terms of its overall distinction and shape as it moves rearward on the car. That crease starts out a little bit fainter up front and then becomes heavier and heavier as it goes rearward on the car. The other interesting thing about this to me is the belt line and how high it is on this particular clay model. And while you certainly have a wraparound front windshield there to some degree, the overall glass area on the side isn't that great because the belt line is so high and the roof line is relatively low. Something just doesn't look quite right here. You got a low roof line and the roof is pretty chunky. The roof needs to be a bit lighter. And then you almost have this enormous lower section of the car and a very small upper. And the, let's say, windshield is moved very far rearward relative to the front axle. Look at that dash to axle proportion on this car. Of course, you also have a little faint fin, and I think I'm discerning from this that maybe that fin is only on the driver's side as opposed to the driver and passenger side. My guess is there were two different rear end proposals on this particular clay model, one on the driver's side, one on the passenger side, which you can't see from this particular shot. Now here is a alternate proposal clay model from a little bit later on, and you'll notice that this has a distinctly different rear. You still have that horizontal, like, I don't want to quite call it a batwing here because it's not as pronounced as it was the 1959 and 1960 models, but you still have that shape to the quarter. And interestingly, the Chevrolet designers have gone with a 4 taillight theme here instead of the 3 taillight theme, which was introduced in 1958 on the Impalas to connote the upper end luxuriness luxuriousness, I guess is the better word, or the correct word, of the Chevrolets. So I guess they were trying to denote that there is a whole new level of luxury in your 1961 Chevrolet because now you have 4 taillights as opposed to 3. And an interesting crease or kind of datum line appears to run this entire car that bisects the tail lamps. I do like that V, how they've done and executed that V in the deck lid and kind of pulled it in a little bit in plan view to give you some visual interest out back. Now, as time went on, by 1959, designers were really starting to, I think, get more comfortable with that light roof look. Here, you can see an extremely light roof. Take a look at those toothpick A-pillars that sweep backward and that little overhang over the backlight. That roof really reminds me of the early Corvairs and the four-door sedans, and it would make sense because obviously that was a Chevrolet as well. But you can tell the overall body and the form here is much lighter than what you saw previously. And like I said, I think designers were starting to get more comfortable with the new styling language. Remember, the previous proposal was done under General Motors' former leadership, that is Harley Earl, who retired in 1959, and once he retired, Bill Mitchell took over as styling vice president, and the two just had a very different design aesthetic, and I think you're starting to see some of the Mitchell influence here. Although you do see some elements of the 1961 Chevrolet clearly in the front end, and that form from the hood that kind of drapes over the side and then moves rearward, but this is still quite different. The front grille that slants inward and has a concave surface. The 4 quad headlamps, of course, would make it to the 1961 Chevrolet, but this doesn't have that really full wall-to-wall grille that the 1961 Chevrolet. And it has this added kind of surface up at the top there of the fender that continues through the door, and that has clearly a highlight on top and a low light on the bottom, casting a shadow, and a little bit too complicated of a surface. And designers would end up revising that surface significantly and toning it down for the final proposal. So some elements of the final design here, but also a lot of work left to do. Now out back, we're starting to get something that more closely approximates the rear of the 1961 Chevrolet, but there's a bit more scalloped nature here to the forms on the deck lid and below the deck lid and just above the rear bumper. Although that triple taillight theme with tail lamps that would be similar to the 1961 Chevrolet is clearly present here. And you can see how distinctive that surface was that I was mentioning at the front of the car, at the top of the fender is. Again, that would not make it through to production. So some elements here are approximating production and some are not. And here is a slightly later proposal. Again, designers are struggling, I think, with trying to make this too complicated. Look at that front end with that bumper that juts out and those points on either end. Take a look at the surfacing in the headlamp area there with all of these intersecting surfaces, the crease that starts on the hood and runs around the side just is intersecting with that top surface on the fender, and then the bumper and the point and this kind of V-shaped area behind the headlamps. There's probably too much just going on there and a little too complicated. And I think the designers, thankfully, in the end, just cleaned this overall style up and came up with a beautiful car that ended up being a tremendous seller. And you can also notice the rear of this roofline is kind of a shameless copy of the 1957 Chryslers. So they had significant influence on General Motors design during this time, as well as other designs too. And here we have the less complicated and final production version of the 1961 Impala. And I have to say, sometimes less is more. And you notice that a lot of those complicated surfaces and forms are here just kind of rationalized away. The front grille is this beautiful wall-to-wall grille that emphasizes the horizontal nature of the car, despite the fact, and I wonder if that choice was made because these cars were a little bit narrower than their predecessors. They were 2.5 inches narrower. And I wonder if designers felt that they needed that full wall-to-wall grille with the block Chevrolet lettering to really emphasize the horizontal nature and offset the fact that these cars were 2.5 inches narrower than the 1960 Chevrolets. And to be honest, it's quite effective. I also love the scallops in the hood, the 2 scalloped out sections to give that hood more dimension. And These cars were, I mentioned already, 2.5 inches narrower than their predecessors, but they were 1.5 to 2 inches shorter as well, despite riding atop the same 119-inch wheelbase. It was felt that it was time to make American cars a little bit more sensibly sized. And you notice this in the early 1960s. Of course, you have the introduction of the compact Corvair from General Motors, as well as the senior compacts, the Olds F85, the Buick Special, the Pontiac Tempest. You have the Ford Falcon being introduced at the same time. You have the Valiant from Chrysler being introduced at the same time. Of course, you also have other small cars in the market, the Rambler, and people kind of were upset that I forgot to mention the Studebaker Lark in one of my videos. So the Studebaker Lark as well, yes. And, of course, the VW Beetle. So cars were starting to get smaller, and the American buying public arguably wanted that, perhaps in part because the late 1950s were not great years economically. So a lot of these cars that came out in the early 60s were planned in that late 1950s period during a time when consumers were really trying to pinch their pennies. Of course, by the time the early 1960s rolled around, it was generally good times again, and the economy was starting to take off, and customers wanted big V8s and had more money in their pocket. But this was a car that was successful despite the fact that it was made smaller, and just, again, a gorgeous automobile. Now let's take a look at this beige 61 Impala, and I'm not normally a fan of beige vehicles, but this one I love because it shows off that surface that I was talking about earlier on the clay models, and how designers toned it down and really changed it for the final production variant. Notice that now the surface starts out as basically nothing at the leading edge of the fender, and then gradually gets more and more pronounced as it heads toward the door of the vehicle and has an increasingly large low light section on it. And I think this was a much better execution than what you saw on the clay model. Of course, here you can also see that wall-to-wall grille and the toothpicky A-pillars. Interestingly, GM really with this style of windshield eliminated that dog leg that you had on the previous 1959, 1960 models that created a strange kind of door cut because the windshield slanted backward. And still here you had great visibility as well. Now, if we look at this particular vehicle in the side profile, you'll notice what I was saying before about this very thin roof, complete with its toothpicky A-pillars as well as very thin and tapering C-pillars. And you can see that there's still complicated surfacing here, but less so than the clay models. You have that crease up top that I was mentioning that was toned down in the front, and then it also nicely fades out in the rear. You have that kind of crease that dips down as it goes rearward on the car and then starts to widen and forms that little area where it has the name Impala on the back of the vehicle. And then you have the beautiful wheel arches here that I love, the rear wheel arch in particular and how it's sculpted. It just gives the car this sense of motion. So a pretty car, and notice that the belt line ended up pretty high overall. This car does have a high belt line and a relatively high cowl height. And this was strange. Remember, I just said that this car was basically shorter, taller, and narrower than its predecessor at a time when most designers were trying to espouse the longer, lower, wider look. And despite that, I have to say that the 61 Chevrolet, I think, is just an absolutely gorgeous car, especially from the rear three-quarter view we're going to take a look at now. And here we are. I have to say, for me, this is the prettiest view of the car. I love how that piece of trim here just wraps around the side of the car and forms the leading edge of the deck lid, then dips down into that V shape with these checkered flags, kind of similar to the Corvette and what they would have. And that scalloped out section with the three tail lamps that have these rocket-like exhaust forms or jet exhaust forms. I even like the fake vents underneath the backlight there. Notice the fake vents. This was just something that, I don't know, GM designers had an affinity for fake vents. And that started with the 1958 Impala that had the fake vent at the top in the middle. That was actually supposed to be a real vent until designers tested it with engineers and realized that it was backdrafting into the cabin. So it was made fake. But I think that this is an absolutely gorgeous car, particularly from this angle. The design team led by Claire McKeegan just did an excellent job. And Claire McKeegan had been Chevrolet's chief exterior designer since 1953. So he did a number of Chevrolets. I think this is one of his masterpieces. This is ahead of him going to Opel in the mid-1960s and performing a number of designs there. So great looks, and same with the interior, which we'll talk about now. Now, part of the charm of the 1961 Chevrolets was that they didn't only look good from the outside, but the interiors, particularly of the Impala, just looked rich and gorgeous. Now, this car has a vintage air, I think, or some sort of aftermarket air conditioning unit underneath the dash. So those vents that you see there are not original, and just kind of forget about them. But take a look at the door panels on this car and how finely detailed they are, the seats and the overall patterns of the seats, the beautiful two-tone steering wheel and two-spoke and two-tone steering wheel that the design team just revised from the 1959 variant, still Swiss cheesed to give you that sporty look, but in a whole new way. And you have this hooded instrument panel with the speedometer that is set under this broad hood that I think is just fantastic. The interiors of these, I believe, were designed by Blaine Jenkins, who was the designer on the Chevrolet interiors team during this time frame, and I think the team did just a fantastic job. And here you can see the beautiful dash in this kind of ribbed theme, metallic theme. It's very simple, very elegant. I love the horn buttons, too, on either of the spokes there of the steering wheel. Just a fantastic-looking design, and again, done on a car that was part of the low-priced 3. It's just amazing what designers could do here, and I think they did a fantastic job with the interior. Now let's start with the engines under hood, because there were many different engine options that you could get in your 1961 Impala. And continuing on with the same philosophy that began in 1955 when Chevrolet introduced its overhead valve V8 engine, you had separate series for the 6 and the 8 cylinders. But the 6-cylinder, the base engine, was a 235 cubic inch 6-cylinder, the so-called high thrift engine that basically dated all the way back to 1937. This is really an old engine on your Chevrolets, and it had its last major upgrade in 1953. It had received hydraulic lifters in that model year and really hadn't had much new since then. Great, very smooth engines, but that's what the standard engine was. It made 135 gross horsepower. Then you moved up to the so-called Turbo Fire, 238 cubic inch engine that was standard in the V8 models, and that made 170 horsepower in base form with a 2-barrel carburetor. If you got a 4-barrel, there was a 230 horsepower variant of that. And the great thing about the V8 was that it basically had the same fuel efficiency as a 6-cylinder, but it shaved 5 seconds off the 0 to 60 time. The 6-cylinder was really pokey, about 19 seconds, 0 to 60. And these base 283s took the car from 0 to 60 in about 14, 15 seconds. So certainly not fast, but heck of a lot faster than the 6-cylinders. Then if you moved up past the small block, you had the Turbo Thrust and Super Turbo Thrust 348 cubic inch big block V8s that started at a 250 4-barrel variant. There was a 280 horsepower 3 2-barrel variant. And then there was a 348 cubic inch engine that had 305 horsepower with a very large 4-barrel carburetor, and then 2 ultra-high compression, solid lifter, 348 cubic inch engines with 4-barrel carburetors and 3 2-barrel carburetors, respectively, making 340 and 350 gross horsepower. By the way, both of those so-called special V8 engines had dual breaker point distributors and 11.25 to 1 compression ratio. 11.25 to 1. Those were some serious engines. Now, later in the model year, Chevrolet did introduce the 409 cubic inch V8 underhood, and there was a solid lifter 409 with a 4-barrel carb that made 360 horsepower, but the 409s were very, very rare in 1961 Chevrolets. Very few hundreds, let's say, were produced, maybe even less than that. But it certainly earned a reputation, shall we say. As for transmissions, there were 3 and 4-speed manual transmissions. Of course, Chevrolet's Power Glide was available. And then there was the triple turbine Turbo Glide, which was an infamously unreliable transmission that Chevrolet used just for a few model years. And then it was sunset, really due to reliability issues. We'll talk more about that in a subsequent video. In general, the combination of great styling along with ease of serviceability and reliability, well, for everything but the Turbo Glide transmission, really combined to make the 1961 Chevrolets extremely successful. And I have to say, these are one of my favorite early 1960s GM cars that just are styled to perfection. What do you think? Put a comment in the comments section and let me know. And what do you think about those crazy early design proposals for the 1961 Chevrolet? Thanks again for watching.